All right, we're 12 on the dot, so I'm going to get things started. Welcome to all of you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me on this lovely Monday, wherever you are across the state. My name is Stacey DeCalma. I work here at the Queensland Council of Social Service in our sector capacity team, and it's my pleasure to present this webinar today. We've been working with DESBT over quite a few years now to present workshops, webinars, and produce some resources that assist the community services sector to submit really good applications for Skilling Queenslanders for work. So I'd like to welcome any of our DESBT colleagues who might be on the line this morning. There's quite a few of them, so welcome to all of you, and please jump in with any comments or clarifications throughout this presentation if you would like to. And for those participants on the line, you're welcome to take yourself on mute to ask questions or utilise the chat if that's easier, and I'll make sure I check that throughout the presentation. Now, before I move into the content of the workshop, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today. For me, that's the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people on the line today. And of course, that acknowledgement extends to the traditional custodians of the land that you're all sitting on today across this beautiful state. And specifically, I want to mention the Darumbal people of Central Queensland, on whose land I was born and raised, and acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and the sea in that area. Okay, so this is a pretty quick webinar today to go through some of those tips and tricks that are going to assist you to submit a really polished application for Skilling Queenslanders for work. Now, there's a variety of people on the line with different experiences when it comes to engaging with Skilling Queenslanders for work, and that fantastic initiative. So some of you have submitted applications before, and for some of you this might be your first time submitting an application, and this round closes in just 10 days. So this is a great time to be reviewing the draft that you've got together, or some of the materials that you've got together, to make sure you've got all those boxes ticked for a really fantastic submission. Now, because this is really around tender writing, I'm not going to go into great detail about Skilling Queenslanders for work itself as an initiative. Really, there's a webinar on our website, the QCOS website, entitled Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And that's really the best place to go at the moment, other than DESBT website itself, if you're looking for a webinar that goes through each of the programs within that initiative. Lots of detail in that, including things like eligibility. And I think a really useful aspect of that webinar is the examples of projects that have been delivered under the different programs. So I do recommend you checking that out, and we'll make sure there's a link in the post event email. So for the webinar today, we're going to go through these 6 elements: what to consider before you start writing a project summary, addressing the assessment criteria, reducing your word count, which is a pretty critical aspect for this one, gathering your evidence, and a few things to go through just before you hit submit. And of course, I'm going to be using the context of Skilling Queenslanders for work, but these tips and tricks can really be applied to most of the submissions that you'll be working on. Okay, so our first tip is to consider quite a few things before you actually start writing. There's a lot of thinking to be done before you start putting pen to paper, or typing, as the case may be with this, but it saves you a lot of time in the long run. So it really does pay to do your research and planning well before you start writing your application, and make sure you can address the selection criteria both thoroughly and succinctly. So in a Grants in Australia report, 54% of the respondents to that survey said that they didn't end up submitting, which is a fair proportion. And 38% said it was because they ran out of time to complete the application form. So I can't promise you to give you any more time, but with these tips and utilising the resources that we have available, you can save yourself some time in the long run. by writing a really well-structured proposal. Collaborative projects such as Skilling Queenslanders work rely heavily on partnerships across organisations. So building those relationships early on in the piece is absolutely critical. So there's a few things here that you need to be working on before you even start writing a proposal itself. Okay, so one of the tips that we have is to create a grants reference library. Now, this helps to avoid the last minute hassle of scrambling for information like your financial statements or your insurance details or your ABN, that kind of thing at the last minute, which can be very stressful. I've experienced it myself, but it can also be stressful for the other people in your organization. We are all fairly well experienced these days with the fact that COVID or natural disasters and things like this can interrupt our timelines. And it does mean that sometimes people are unexpectedly away from work or the office. So having a central place where these important documents are kept, where everyone in the organisation knows where they are, is really quite a useful thing to get together. So you have one point of truth. And for example, if your finance officer does get COVID or someone has experienced flooding and can't come into work this week, you know where the financial statements are and you know where the insurance certificate is, that kind of thing. You might even like to include in a reference library like this a list of ideas that you or your team have worked on before that you don't have funding for, but you've put enough thought into it to create an ideas document. And when suitable funding does come up, you've got an idea there ready to go for it. You might be able to think of quite a few different things you could keep in this grants reference library. Audited financial statements, that's an important one, and that's something you will need for Skilling Queenslanders for work. Insurance details, your proof of not-for-profit status might be something you're including. Quite a few things that you can be including in there. Many applications or grants these days require the resumes of key personnel that will be working on something. So there's quite a few different things that you could be keeping in that central place. Another thing that will make your writing a lot easier is having on hand a brief description of your organisation and what you do. Generally, that's the kind of thing that might sit on a website in your About Us tab, if you're an organisation that's large enough to have a website. And it's a brief description that your board or governing committee has approved that describes what you do well. You can also keep in here evidence of your organisation's success. So feedback, really good evaluation data is a great thing to be keeping in there. Even past grant applications. Not that I would recommend copying and pasting from past grant applications, but if you've done some really good thinking and writing previously for something similar, it's good to not have to completely go back to writing it from scratch and have something to work from. So that can be a useful thing to be keeping in that central point too. Okay, so the next step in this process is to map out your project idea in more detail. So think about all the elements of your project. So who your participants will be, what partners you're going to be working with, and how you're going to deliver, so that when it comes to writing your application and answering the assessment criteria, you have a much clearer idea of what to include. And it also helps to make sure you think about how and if your project fits with your strategic plan and your organisation's mission. We've got a few people in the waiting room, I'm just going to let them in. While I'm doing that, I'll just check everyone can see the screen properly and audio is okay. I can hear someone just took themselves off mute. Great, thank you, Tina. Excellent. Got a few others coming in from the waiting room. I'll just let them in. Good morning. Okay, So the next step in the process, as I've said, is to map out your project in great detail. You're thinking about your partners, you're thinking about who the beneficiaries of your project is. So when it comes to writing your application and answering the assessment criteria, you have a really clear idea about what your project actually looks like. And the important thing about this is that those who you're working on the project with all share the vision. So mapping out the project idea is a really critical aspect. And this is where you're considering also if your project fits with your strategic plan and your organization's mission. Is it a good fit, or is there too much that needs to be massaged and tweaked?
No.
And of course, making sure you're reading the funding guidelines before you start writing your application. So in that same Grants in Australia report that I mentioned earlier, a significant proportion of respondents to that survey said they didn't end up submitting in the end because as they got down the line, they realized that they weren't actually eligible for some reason. And there's unfortunately no shortcut to this. Reading the guidelines is just something that has to be done to make sure that your organisation is eligible to receive the funding. And I actually think DESBIT's guidelines for funding for Skilling Queenslanders work is a really good one. It's quite easy to read, easy to find on the website. And it's not a painful guide to funding to read through. So absolutely recommend you going through that document before you get any further down the line of writing an application. Those guides for funding often include things like the expected KPIs, how much funding is available, all of those kinds of things that will really help shape your project idea anyway. Okay, so at this stage, you're assessing the requirements of the funder. This is really important because it's key to knowing whether or not you want to proceed with your proposal and if it will meet the criteria. And of course, you need to demonstrate in your submission that you can meet all of the program requirements. So we want to be doing this very early on in the process, well before we're actually writing the application itself. Now, for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, we do recommend you contact your local DESBIT regional office to discuss the project idea and the proposal before you submit. And this, contacting them and having a chat to their team about your project idea will give you a really good idea about whether or not it's something that needs a little bit of tweaking or if they think it will be a successful project. So I don't think there's any regional offices out there that want to be receiving applications from an organisation that they've never connected with before. So please give them a call. If any of our DESBIT colleagues are on the line and want to comment on that, please do. But they are really willing to discuss your idea with you and give you some tips or some feedback about that before you put pen to paper. Now, it's helpful at this stage to be setting up a tender team and think about their roles and their responsibilities. So think about who else might be involved in your submission. So, for example, does someone need to approve your application before you submit? And who's getting the letters of support that you need for the partners who you'll be working with? Some of the roles you might like to think about assigning could include the person who's doing the bulk of the writing, someone who's going to edit it, or at least proofread it before it's submitted. A partnership broker, you might be an organisation that has several projects on the go in several regions. You might need to think about the person that, if you're in an organisation where approval needs to be sought from your governing body before you submit applications, that's another one to keep in mind. So even if someone's role in the submission seems quite small, like the IT person who helps you with problems uploading your documents, or someone who's proofreading, if you've got everyone on board early and include them officially in that team and they know what the due date is and what part they're playing in the process, you'll get a lot more ownership and buy-in to the project, which can be quite, it can be really make a difference between having a smooth process and a little more painful process. So having everyone aware of what their role is and when they need to be doing it, that's really critical. It helps to have a kickoff meeting with your tender team to start some more detailed planning. It's a really good idea to get everyone to go through the documents, look at the requirements. It's easy for one person, if they're the one looking through all the documents in great detail, to miss something. So always beneficial to have more than one person going through all those key documents, acknowledging, of course, that some of you are coming from quite small organisations where you don't have the luxury of a larger team to go through these things. But if you do, having more people on board always makes it a little easier. Okay, so your tender response plan checklist. It's helpful to have a checklist like this to capture all of the things we've just talked about. So the requirements you found, assigning your team roles, and to agree at least at a basic level about the elements of your proposal and to detail your tasks and your timeline. And you can find an example of a tender checklist on our website. We also have a grants on a page resource that we will include in the post-event email that makes sure you're looking at all these critical elements on one piece of paper, which is a really useful tool, particularly in this early planning stage and when you have more than one partner involved. So if we have one key message for you today, it really is to think before you write. It's very important to plan your approach to writing your submission and get clarity before you start writing. That one tip in itself will save you a lot of time with editing and backtracking. Okay, we're going to move into writing a project summary. Just got some more people joining us. Okay, so project summary. This is pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? It's the who, what, where, why, how. But it's easy to get carried away with project summaries, isn't it? Where we start to waffle on about the project, and keeping it really clear and brief can sometimes be tricky. So these are the things that we're going to focus on for a project summary. It needs to provide a brief overview of the project's aims. So what will be achieved? Who will be assisted and what services will be delivered? You need to explain the benefits or the appropriateness of the qualifications to be delivered and the support services to be offered to the cohort being targeted. If applicable, you can detail here your partnerships with other community organisations or other wraparound services that you're working with. Detail the tailored individual support and other assistance that will be provided to all participants for the duration of the project. This can be both in-house or external services. It should include personal support that addresses work-related and non-work-related issues. So if you have been involved with Skilling Queenslanders for Work before, you will know or seen any of the example projects in the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinar. You'll see that there's a myriad of wraparound support offered to Skilling Queenslanders for Work participants. And that's because success when it comes to Skilling Queenslanders for Work is really two-pronged. It's about gaining qualifications, but it's also about long-term employment for those who are underutilised or have been underemployed in the workforce for quite some time. So there is quite a few different barriers we're addressing through Skilling Queenslanders for Work, and that requires a lot of wraparound support. I have been really inspired by the sample projects detailed in the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinar, because this initiative really allows for some very creative and robust supports around participants. And this here in your application is your chance to detail all the ways that you can offer that support to the participants you're targeting. And here are some of the things that you might be including. There's foundation skills, life skills, counselling services or other appropriate referrals, workplace preparation skills, case management, activities to build confidence and address barriers that these participants are facing, job search assistance, post-participant support. There's all kinds of things that can be detailed here. We've seen some great ones, things like Dress for Success, where participants are offered a new outfit for interviews and for their entry into the workforce. Lots of different things. So for your Skilling Queenslanders for Work application, if someone reading your application can answer these questions on the screen, then you're on the right track. So who's your cohort? Who are you going to be working with, and how will you address the barriers and assist them? How will you reach them and recruit them? That's something to keep in mind. I have heard of projects before where organisation has had a really creative idea, but then when they've actually come to delivering the project itself, they've had trouble actually recruiting participants for it. So who would you be recruiting for this project? Do you already know who they are? What are some of the strategies you have if you're having trouble recruiting? Is your recruitment pool realistic? How many people you've said you're going to put through your project, do you think you really could recruit that many? So keeping in mind all of those things. What's the project you're delivering, and what qualifications and training will you be providing? What supports and special assistance will you give them? Where are you delivering, and how does it benefit the local community? What jobs will participants be eligible for once they've completed the program, and what's the local need for those jobs? Who will you be working with, and what level of industry involvement will there be? Who are the local employers who support the project? And how are you going to evaluate the success of this project? So really, really important things to keep in mind.
Okay.
Oh, we've got someone who's not on mute. Sorry, I'm just going to mention that so you can, or you might find yourself spotlighted. If everyone can just check that they're on mute, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. All right, so addressing the assessment criteria. Once you've gained clarity on your project idea, you can address the assessment criteria succinctly and thoroughly. Now, the assessment criteria is such a critical thing to be paying attention to, because it tells you very clearly what your funder wants to know from you. So in any tender development process, responding to the assessment criteria is the biggest part of your writing effort. Your answers will only be as good as the thinking you have done during your preparation for them. They're your opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the requirements, that you can provide evidence, you can demonstrate your capacity to deliver and manage, demonstrate value for money, and to articulate your unique value proposition. So the assessment or selection criteria should reflect what is most important to the funder. So it's not the time to be talking about lots of things that they haven't actually asked about. Particularly for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you've got a really strict character count, not just word count, but character count. And you can't actually input any extra words other than what's allowed in the portal, in the box that you're entering your text into. So it's very important to stick to answering what's actually being asked of you. So if we look at the guide to applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, which is on the DESBT website, and again, we will include this in the post-event email, I'll go through the criteria now. So the first one is capacity to manage. And what's being asked here is around issues such as the financial viability of the lead organisation, which is probably you. What's your structure, governance, risk management and reporting framework? What is your relationship with the nominated RTO? And importantly, what relevant experience you have in this area. So what the department really wants to know is, can your organisation deliver what you say you're going to deliver? Some of this information you will have in your grants reference library if you've decided to set one up. So you can see the benefit of having that information in one handy spot. So what you need to address here for Skilling Queenslanders for Work is information about your organisation, your track record and staff experience linking back to how you're going to deliver the project. Your chosen participants. This covers a range of different aspects, so including your organisation's experience in dealing with the identified cohort and understanding their barriers to employment. It also includes articulating how you're going to reach and recruit participants and ensure that they're eligible for the program. Further in this criteria, you need to include information about the experience your organisation has in delivering training or projects outside an institutional setting and in a community-based environment. Now, one thing I will mention here, just in case you're new to this process and not aware, Skilling Queenslanders for Work is assessed in two different stages. The first stage is assessing your capacity to manage. So DESBIT will assess your application. If your organisation or your application does not satisfy their need to see that you have capacity to manage, your application will not progress to the next stage. So it's really important to have equal effort and evidence produced in your responses to all of the criteria, because if you're not able to establish your capacity to manage, unfortunately, all the effort and energy you have put into the other criteria won't actually even be looked at. So establishing your capacity to manage is very important. Oh, my mouse is not cooperating. I've just had someone come into the waiting room. So let me just admit them. Okay, so criteria 2, servicing community and industry need. So what's being asked here is, how does your project fit into your local community? And we know that Skilling Queenslanders for Work is really community-based. So they need to be able to see that your project suits the needs of your local community, that it's not just a statewide generic type project. What's the community benefit and what is the community need? What's the link between the learner group and the skills shortage and labour needs in the local community where you're proposing to deliver this project? If your organisation is based outside of the delivery area, you will need to address the community industry links in the delivery location, and you will have a case to make as far as your ability as an organisation to deliver that project well in that community. Make sure you very clearly articulate what these links are. So what you need to address here is that you know your community, that you know who needs work, and that there's an industry that suits them and fills the labour shortage. You also need to show your links to employers in the community. So the other thing to address is how you might be linking with other initiatives or services. Yeah. Okay, so criteria 3, strategies to assist participants. What's being asked here is how are you going to support participants to overcome barriers to learning and employment? So support might include things like providing career advice, job preparation skills, communication skills, mentoring, psychological or mental health support, or individual case management. Support might include things like assisting participants to get their learner's license, because having a license is going to be a critical aspect of having securing long-term employment for them. So that might be a very practical thing that they need assistance with to be able to meet that requirement, which is long-term employment. So what you need to address here is that you show that you understand the people that you're going to be working with and you understand their barriers to employment and that you're prepared to address those barriers. Spell out how you're going to support the participants to overcome those barriers. Outline the learning needs and goals which are appropriate to the participants you're targeting. Talk about how you're going to provide job placement and post-placement support and what your transition to employment, what that strategy actually looks like. And criteria 4, outcomes. Now, this assessment criteria really comes down to the key objective of the program, which is how are you going to help your participants get a job? So put in any examples of past performance and outcomes achieved, either for SKU or comparable projects. So you can see here why it's really important to properly evaluate any work that you do, because it's all a part of the evidence base for future funding. And if you have provided or delivered a Skilling Queenslanders for Work project before, that's very beneficial because you will now have something very concrete to be able to base this selection criteria on. Okay, so the criteria for cost or value for money. This is the final one, and it's really important. So it's important to outline how much in-kind contribution is included and what it entails. In-kind contributions are those that you may not be paying any cash for, but your own organisation or your partner organisations or local businesses are contributing to the project. It's really important that you're clear on what that in-kind contribution looks like and what its value is. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail into the budget in a minute, because it's such a critical aspect of your application. And it's one where there are a few common pitfalls that we can address. So what are the value adds? An example of value add or in-kind support might be providing resume writing skills, doing interview training. In-kind support might include things like the fact that you don't need to pay for a training room because you've got an organisational training room and you're going to be providing that. It might be that you have your organisation or your partner organisation has a minibus and you're going to be using that for transporting participants to different locations for either training or work experience or whatever it is. So think about all the aspects of your project, what you're paying for cash for, what's in-kind support, and making sure you're really clear about that. And don't forget that in-kind support being provided by partner organisations needs to be detailed in your letters of support. So that's why it's very clear right early on, before you're even in the writing stage, is being clear about the vision for your project with your partner organisations. So everyone's really clear what they're contributing to the process and what's going to be expected from them as the project is actually delivered. So having that within your letters of support, really very much necessary. Okay, so these tips apply to your tender writing projects across the board. Be realistic when you're setting your budget. You want to be competitive, but you also need to ensure that you have thought about all the costs in delivering the project. If your costs are on the higher side, make sure you explain why in your application. So Desmond isn't just looking for the cheapest option. They do have benchmarks, but you don't necessarily need to be the cheapest. But what they would want to see is detail in your budget that explains why you came to the cost that you've outlined in your budget. For example, if you're delivering in a remote location, transport costs are higher. Put the rationale in how you came to those estimates. A detailed budget gives your funder confidence in what they're funding. A vague budget can cause hesitation, and it can also become a headache for you when you're trying to reconcile finances at the end of a project. So detail is beneficial for everyone involved. If you've ever been included in taking up a project midway through, a detailed budget is very helpful, particularly when you haven't been present for the beginnings of a project, because you will know what is meant to be covered, what's already been paid for, what things are eligible and ineligible for the funding, all of those kinds of things. They're not the kinds of things you want to be working out the detail of part way or even at the end of a project. Again, ensuring that all in-kind support in your application, whether it's financial or not, is included and it's detailed in those letters of support. Make sure you read the guide to funding to see what's allowed and what's eligible for funding. You don't want to be caught out trying to claim something that actually isn't eligible for the funding. So an example of that for Skilling Queenslanders for Work is you can't be buying office computers or a new vehicle for your organisation with your funding, but you can pay for things like travel bus vouchers for participants to use to get to and from work, and you can provide a subsidised meal program. So it's very clear in the guidelines for the funding what's eligible and what's ineligible. And think about how you're going to acquit your grant and how you're going to demonstrate that the amount of time and effort that you budgeted for in kind has actually been contributed. This is a really important thing, the acquittal of finances. If you do not have an accounting system that's sophisticated enough to be able to pull out all the transactions relating to your Skilling Queenslanders for Work project, you may need a separate bank account. That's the kind of thing that you want to know right from the get-go and have set up right at the beginning. It's not something you want to be backtracking and having to sort out a few weeks or months down the road. So definitely be checking out what your obligations are on the financial side of things. Okay, so key wins for your proposal to make sure your proposal stands out. You need to explain how your project meets the program objectives and improves the situation for participants. Demonstrate how it delivers specific benefit to your community. Make it clear to see why your organisation is best placed to deliver this project in this community to this group of people. In summary, you need to explain why the committee should choose your organisation and your project and not another organisation. Okay, reducing the word count. Now, some people don't struggle with this kind of thing, but I certainly do. I'm not a woman of few words, and unfortunately that applies to my writing as well. So reducing the word count is something that I'm always looking to do. Now, for hopefully you can identify who this little gold man is. I'm sorry if you're not familiar with Star Wars. This is C-3PO for anyone who's not familiar. And this guy is going to help you remember the 3 C's, a P and an O. They're going to help you with your word count or character count, as the case might be with Skilling Queenslanders for work. Okay, so our first C is clear. We want to be simple and direct. Now, when I say your response should be clearly written, I mean using simple and direct language, using a predominantly active voice. And interestingly, look, there's evidence that people are more likely to believe what you have written when it is simple to understand. People pick up on unnecessarily complicated language and what you're trying to do there when you're using fancy words in a situation where it's not necessary. People are much more likely to believe what you have written or what you're saying when you're being simple and direct. Now, the important thing about writing simply and directly is that it requires clarity of thought, which is why it's so important to have thought your plan, what your plan is and what your approach is before you actually start writing. That helps us to avoid the waffling that can happen when we're not exactly sure what it is that we're trying to say. So use simple words such as use instead of utilize or need instead of require. Lose the adverbs and any words that don't add value, such as really, basically, actually. And this is, especially important when you're trying to work within that word count. This is where the proofreader is really going to come in handy for you. You should avoid using verbose or complicated language and complex long sentences. Don't use jargon, euphemisms or cliches. They will usually add words and they're not actually necessary for this kind of writing. As far as things like acronyms go, keep in mind that the people assessing your application might not actually be from your sector or industry. So obviously acronyms that are well known in society, they're fine. But if you're using more sector-specific acronyms, you can write them the title or the name out in full and then put the acronym in brackets and then use that for the rest of the paragraph or the writing. But just keep in mind that your audience who is reading this may not be as familiar with the jargon of your sector as you are. Now, your response should be concise. Rather than less is more, think enough is more. It's about using your best examples and your best evidence to support your point and knowing when you've done enough for that. It's not about you listing every project you've ever worked on that was great in your organisation. It's about picking which examples are going to best demonstrate the evidence that supports the project idea you're putting forward this time. The opposite to being concise is failing to get to the point. So you see this often in responses that include lots of detail and examples, but don't make explicit connections between them and don't seem to have a clear purpose. So often when this is the case, we'll be using more examples than what's really needed. And it's sometimes compensating for the fact that the examples don't really work for the point that we're trying to make. When you fail to get to the point, you are asking the reader to do all the work to construct meaning from your text. And it is a principle of good writing, and particularly tender writing, to make the reader do as little work as possible. You need to make it very clear the point that you're trying to make. Comprehensive. So you can't just cherry pick the bits that you feel comfortable with or the bits that you know you have some good evidence for and then ignore the other things or skim over them. Remember that your answer is being scored on each criterion and each subcomponent of the criterion. So if there are 3 points you need to address and you just focus on 2 of those points in your answer, you are limiting your possible score. because they're not going to be able to give you much. Even if the points you have made to address those first two things are fantastic, 10 out of 10 or 100 out of 100 responses to those two components, if you have skimmed over or skipped that third component, they're not going to be able to give you a full score because you've skimmed over something. So as good as your writing might be in one element, you need to make sure you're providing a balanced response for every response, that you do address every aspect of the criteria and what it's asking you. If you watch the tender writing workshop, our lengthier workshop that looks at tender writing, there is a really handy scaffolding structure for writing there, where we actually break down, actually pulling the assessment criteria apart and allocating an amount of words to each of the subcomponents. And that can be a really handy way of making sure you do provide a balanced answer to every assessment criteria that's asked of you. Okay, so we need to make it persuasive. We need to ensure that the reader believes your claims. And when I say persuasive, I do not mean persuading anyone of anything that's not true, but it means having evidence on hand and examples on hand that ensures the reader can absolutely believe without a doubt what you're saying. So we do this by providing good examples and evidence. And that is the reason why your evaluation for each project that you work on, whether it's Skilling Queenslanders for work or otherwise, is so critical. We want to avoid here making unsubstantiated claims and failing to provide evidence or examples. Sometimes you will see organisations make claims like, we're the industry leader in this field. If you say things like that, the onus is on you to provide the evidence for that. Do not make vague claims. Ensure that you actually, it's a substantiated claim. And be specific, and then provide an example. Being relevant is a critical feature of a good response. So make sure your points link to the requirements of the program and focus on the benefits you're offering to maximise the relevance. Now, do you need extra help with editing? I did mention before that not everyone has the luxury of having a large team to assist them with tender writing. So it's always a good idea to get someone who's a bit removed from the writing process to help with editing and proofreading. A fresh pair of eyes is going to pick up things that you have missed. Apart from calling on your tender team, you could ask a colleague within the sector or another volunteer to go through the application and tell you what they think the project is about. Getting that objective feedback will give you a great clue as to whether your writing is clear enough. You will know from any writing you've done, once your head is in it, it's really hard to be able to provide yourself that objective feedback, because you know what the project's about. You've been living and breathing it for the past few weeks while you've been writing this tender application, and you're not going to pick up on the fact that someone with no knowledge of the project doesn't quite understand this element of it, or this part's not particularly clear. We haven't really said enough about who the partners in the project is. So someone who's removed from the process is going to be able to give you that really valuable feedback about how clear the project is to someone who's reading it for the first time. If you're looking for other ways to edit or proofread, there is a range of online and offline editing software available these days, such as Grammarly or the Hemingway app. We'll include links to those in the post-event email. So that was Grammarly or Hemingway app. As I've mentioned, I know not everyone has a team of people to call on for writing feedback. So at the bare minimum, if you don't have anyone who's able to do that function for you, or something happens and that person's not available to you, using one of these apps is a good way to get immediate feedback about grammar, spelling, that kind of thing. It will also pick up on unnecessary words and give you suggestions for how to word things differently. So it might not give you feedback on the clarity of the messaging itself, but as far as the right technical writing aspect, they can be really useful tools. Okay, so providing evidence is the key to supporting your application. And for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, there are some specific pieces of evidence you will need. So one of the best ways to persuade assessors to believe the claims in your funding proposals is to provide good examples and evidence. So you can use evidence to demonstrate your capabilities and your experience and to show support from your community, to support your case for the need for your proposal and to emphasise the scale or importance of an issue. So you should avoid making generalised claims. As I've said, things like we're an industry leader in our field. Make sure you've got something to back that up. So include the sources of your evidence. These are the kinds of things that you're going to be looking at as sources for evidence. You might be able to include past evaluation data, letters of support from those who have worked with you before, and other data sources. These are the kinds of things you might like to include in that grants reference library. You can call on them quite easily when you're putting together funding proposals. Now, to ensure that your evidence adds weight to your application, you need to ensure that it is specific. So, example, instead of saying youth unemployment is high, it would be better to back this up with local data and say something along the lines of unemployment for 18 to 24-year-olds in our area is 17.8%, which is significantly higher than the regional average of 8%. For example, so you might be looking at census data, local council data. There's quite a few different places you can be gaining this evidence from. And be relevant. You need to ensure that your evidence is relevant to the funding and to the project that you're applying for. So for example, instead of saying we have lots of experience in delivering a range of services, be specific about what training you've delivered and how it relates to your application. And use the most up-to-date evidence and data that you can find. Old evidence is far less persuasive. Don't rely on evidence from a previous application. Make sure if you're rewriting an application that you've submitted previously for Skilling Queenslanders Work, make sure you're checking that there's not more up-to-date information. This is really important, not only so that we can put together a persuasive application, but it makes sure that we ourselves are checking that what we think is correct, because data changes, and sometimes our minds don't keep up with what the contemporary data says. So we might think something is true, and then when we go to check for the evidence or for the data, we realize, oh, that story has actually changed a little bit from last time I looked at this, and maybe I need to tweak my project idea to suit the current data. There has been a lot of workforce and employment changes over the last couple of years. We've had all kinds of things affecting workforce data in this country and in this state. So really important that you check those data sources before you submit your application to make sure they're correct. Of course, we need to acknowledge where we're getting our information from. This is good practice in any kind of writing, but your evidence will be much more persuasive if you can attribute it clearly. Okay, again, so sources for evidence: local council, regional development authority, Bureau of Statistics, the Stat Office, different government department research bodies, employment websites. You might even have your own organisational data that you can utilise, particularly if your organisation, your core work is working with a particular target cohort. For Skilling Queenslanders Work, you will probably already have quite a bit of data on hand about working with that cohort, whether it's young people or veterans or whoever it is. I'm sure that your organisation already has some good data on hand. For Skilling Queenslanders for Work, the application process asks you to provide evidence from local employers that they support the project that you're proposing. So make sure that this is specific to the project, not just support for your organisation. That's really important. It doesn't have to be a commitment from an employer that they will absolutely be providing jobs, although that would be good. But it does need to show that they support what you are trying to deliver in the project, that the skills your participants are gaining are in demand demand for your specific locality. And then employers would be likely to employ someone with those skills in your region. So again, it's really important that those letters of support from the industry and from any partners, if they're writing letters for you, that you're checking that they don't just support your organisation, but they support the project idea itself. So if I'm gaining a letter of support for my Skilling Queenslanders for Work application, I do not need, and I've decided to do barista training because baristas are, a qualification shortage in my local area in West End. I don't need a letter from a local cafe saying that QCOS is a great organisation and they've loved working with us in the past. That's lovely, but it doesn't meet the requirements of a letter of support. A letter of support needs to say, we really enjoy working with QCOS. We support their project idea. This is a skills barista. Baristas are in short supply in West End. We would be looking to employ someone with this skill in the near future. The rest of what they're trying to say in that letter. But what I'm trying to say here is that the letters of support need to specifically support your project idea and not just your organisation. And of course, don't use letters of support from previous applications or for another project, because that won't be specific to the project you are submitting an application for this time around. So making sure, even if you have worked with a partner before and you're doing kind of a repeat project, you're doing the same thing, make sure those letters of support get updated. You also need to provide evidence of any in-kind support you are receiving, both from your own organisation or from other providers. And again, make sure those letters are current and relevant to the project that you're applying for funding for. Make sure they're specific about the type of support and the value of the services being provided in kind. And again, this is great for your funders. They want to see this kind of detail because they want to feel really confident about what it is that they are funding. But it's of benefit to you and your organisation as well. Getting this kind of detail down on paper right at the beginning of a project, a funding proposal even, it just will help you out in the long run. It's really clear then which partners agreed to do what. It's down on paper. You're not going to get 6 months down the track and realise that you never actually quite decided who would be supplying which element of the project and that kind of thing. So we want to be really clear about these things right from the get-go anyway. Now, just before you hit your submit, we've got about 8 minutes to go, so I'm going to run through these last tips. Check, make sure you've answered all the questions being asked and all elements of the question. Again, make sure you're giving equal and balanced answers for all of those assessment criteria. You haven't glossed over one aspect because you didn't really have an example for it or you don't have any data for it. Plan right from the get-go what key messages you're including in each assessment criteria response, and make sure you've got some evidence or some kind of foundation for each of those key messages, and you're not glossing over any aspect because you won't be able to get a full mark for it. Do your figures add up? This is really important. You would be very surprised how common it is to receive budgets as part of funding applications where the dollars don't add up. So, as I would suggest getting someone to proofread the writing itself, get someone to proofread the budget. Get a calculator out, make sure it actually adds up, and that there's not too many guesstimates in there, that you actually have a rationale for how you came up with the costs. For something like a funding proposal that includes trainees that may attract work cover costs, make sure you're checking your insurance policy so that you're budgeting for the correct amount. Things like that. Then it's not hard to do, but it make sure that your budget is really accurate. And have you included all your in-kind contributions? Have you demonstrated your experience in working with your chosen participants? Hopefully you're not straying too far from your day-to-day core business and you're going to be working with a target cohort that you're fairly familiar with. Have you outlined how you're going to recruit participants and check that they're eligible for the program? Have you made a connection between the cohort you're planning to work with and the industry you're targeting for employment? Have you included current letters from employers that support your planned project? Have you clearly articulated any in-kind contribution but from your organisation and from other organisations or businesses? Have you clearly outlined your local connections in the region that you're applying for? And have you made the community benefit of the project really clear? Ensure that you have allowed time to proofread your application. It's a really good idea to have someone not involved in the writing of the application to read it, to make sure that the messages are clear and that someone who has no idea about the project at all, which will be probably the person reading it on the other end, that it's really clear to someone who hasn't got prior knowledge. And before you submit, make sure that you have included all the right attachments. So it's quite clear when you log into the Skilling Queensland or the DESBT portal for submitting Skilling Queenslanders for work funding applications. There's a box where you put in your text in response to the assessment criteria. And then there's document upload points where you can be attaching your letters of support and all of those kinds of things. So make sure you've got all of those ready to go. If you haven't created yourself an account, make sure you do that and get familiar with the portal before that due date, which is 31st of March, 5 p.m. sharp. Making sure that you've checked out that portal before that last day and you're clear on where you need to be attaching documents and inputting your text. So to sum up, we've provided a checklist for you to go through once you've completed your application to ensure that you've addressed all the issues that we've discussed here. And remember that once you've submitted your application, you can't edit it. So make sure you've ticked off all these points before you hit submit. And the grant on a page resource on the QCOS website has a checklist much like this one on the back page, so you can kind of have everything together. That resource is really helpful for getting together with all your partners, so within your internal team working on the project, but also any partners, to make sure you're all on the same page and you've got the same vision for your project that you're hoping to deliver. So any comments before I finish up? We've got a couple of minutes, so time for comments or questions if anyone has any.
Faylene here. Thank you very much for that very informative discussion.
You're welcome.
And presentation. We're probably not going to be ready for the 31st. How often are these going to be released?
Very good question. So the good thing about Skilling Queenslanders for Work is that there is generally 2 rounds in the financial year. So this one is ending on the 31st of March, but there will be another round in the second half of the year.
Okay, so, and if I just go onto their website and just keep an eye on the...
That's right. So we don't know what the date will be for the next one. And I don't think DESBT even knows what the date for the next one will be. But yes, if you keep an eye on things, you'll find out about them when the next round is opening up, and you'll be able to submit an application that time around. So look, that is thank you for that question, because I do want to reiterate that for those, it's much better to get started now on building your project idea and building up those robust partnerships required for a good project, but don't rush it to push through an application now for the next 10 days because there will be another opportunity to apply for the funding, and you're much better off holding off and working on a really solid application rather than, you know, submitting something that's not quite right. So thank you for the question. That's a good one. Jacob has said, can we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, I have already saved a PDF of this presentation, and it will go out in the post-event email. Katrina, thank you for your comment. Katrina from DESBT is saying that there are fact sheets on the DESBT website, training and support plans on the website. Look, the DESBT website is great. There's so much information there. There are little videos that you can view on the QCOS website as well, and they're also on the DESBT website with tips about your budget and what kind of support you can offer participants, all of those kinds of things. There's heaps of resources available. Thank you, Katrina. She's already linked that fact sheet in the chat. That's great. So there's a lot there on the DESBT website, some really useful things. And as I've mentioned, your local DESBT office, they want to chat to you. They want to talk to you about your project idea, and they want to be able to give you feedback. So don't be strangers. Definitely give them a call, and make sure that you have a chat to them about your idea. They're waiting to have a chat to you.
Hi, Samantha Carriage here from DESBT and Rocky.
Hi.
Thank you again for another amazing session. I always love joining in and just hearing it all and finding out what the questions are. So probably just one thing from a regional perspective, just to reinforce, talking to us is so important because you don't want to put in an application where there is a huge oversaturation in the market of applications, and you want to make sure that it is really, really geared to that industry need. You know, and that you've got the right fit. Sometimes we've seen applications in the early stages where people have, you know, put in for the wrong program. It might have been a ready for work when it should have been a get set for work, or, you know, something like that. So it's always important just to be able to talk to the local offices, because we understand and appreciate that it is a lot of work, and we want to make sure that you know, it's really geared to what it's intended for. So it's always good to be able to get that guidance. That was probably all I wanted to say.
Absolutely. Yeah. Really good idea. You know, as you've said, Samantha, we don't want an oversaturation of particular cohorts or projects geared to particular things in any one region. You know, you might have a fantastic idea, but 3 other organizations have had the same fantastic idea. So really important to have a chat with those who have that bird's eye view of the whole region and what's going on, which is what people can gain from giving their local DESBT office a call. And of course, so much effort goes into a funding application. We don't want you to be expending a lot of energy on something that needs a bit of a tweak to be successful.
Yes, and feedback is key. I know that you mentioned it earlier in the presentation. Always make sure that you ask for feedback. So the process is obviously to go through skill apps first to be able to get that written feedback. But if you are looking for that additional feedback on your applications, do not hesitate to reach out. That's probably just, you know, the other thing too. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Samantha. And thank you, Katrina, for all those handy links in the chat. Really good. Would love to hear from you in the chat about how you found this workshop. We're always looking to find different ways we can improve it and make it useful for you. So please answer the poll questions if you'd like to give that feedback, and you can get in contact with us. Good luck with your applications. I can't wait to see what SKU projects come out of this round. It'll be really interesting. The workforce trends are changing. I'm really excited to see what creative ideas people have come up with. Thanks all. Good luck in the next 10 days, or preparing for the next round.